want to say much appreciation to our beloved senior pastor, the Reverend Dr. Jacqueline A. Thompson, for this wonderful opportunity this month to present a series of Black History programs. I am Reverend Dr. Martha C. Taylor, the historian archivist for the Allen Temple Baptist Church. So we are pleased that you have tuned in this afternoon to hear a very informative program on education. You know, we're going through quite a bit nowadays on this whole thing of education as it relates to the pandemic, but we're going to look at a subject. Equal education is the great equalizer. And a link will be provided to you for resources a little bit later. We are blessed and honored to have three distinguished educators as conversation partners. Dr. Tasha Dean, Miss Patsy Lax Lockhart, and Mr. Tommie Lindsey. Allow me to please just read briefly their bios, just very briefly, so that you have a sense of who you are conversating with. Dr. Tasha Dean is the Assistant Superintendent of Student Services and Special Education for the Sunnyvale School District in Sunnyvale, California. She has been in leadership with Sunnyvale for the past 8 years. And through her leadership, she has received a Golden Bell Award for social emotional learning programs and other awards and accomplishments. She is a longtime member of Allen Temple Baptist Church. We have Sister Patsy Lax Lockhart. She is a retired educator, K through 12 life credential, national board certified educator in adolescent language arts. And as a teacher consultant in the Bay Area, she has won numerous awards, particularly in the area of a writing project for urban students. Ms. Lockhart is a longtime member of Allen Temple Baptist Church. She has so many awards. We'll talk about those a little bit later. And she continues as a consultant in education. Brother Tommie Lindsey, he is a retired educator known locally and nationally, might I add, for his outstanding work as a forensic coach at the James Logan High School speech, debate, and team program there. He's retired now. So under his leadership, the team achieved unparalleled success as the first school, listen at this, as the first school in the history of the National Speech and Debate Association, and to have won a School of Excellence Award for 19 consecutive years. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including the MacArthur Fellowship, California Teacher of the Year, and the Oprah Winfrey Award. Welcome these distinguished educators. Allow me, before we get into today's conversation, you know, it's Black History Month, so what should we do? We should kind of roll back the curtain a little bit and look at some historical, I would say, hurdles that we as a people have had to overcome. You know, in 1785, Thomas Jefferson, the most well-known framer of the United States Constitution, published a book called The Virginia Notes. And in this book, Thomas Jefferson set the tone for white supremacy. Jefferson wrote these words. Now, he's the framer of the Constitution, that Black people are inferior to white people. Not making this up. All you have to do is look it up. He further wrote that whites and Blacks could not live nor coexist in a society where the Black population was free. In other words, he was advocating for separation. It was a further oppression against Blacks. White supremacy is on top. And he wanted a society where white people were superior to Black people. Now, that's Thomas Jefferson. He also said that our brain size was smaller. Therefore, we could never intellectually be equivalent to white people, and we just were not intelligent. You know that Virginia Notes book has been used as a textbook for white students in the South as a means of furthering white supremacy. And in the meantime, books that told the truth about slavery and our accomplishments were taken off many of the library shelves in Southern states. It was against the law for slaves to read and write. I'm going somewhere with this. Systemic racism runs deep. White privilege runs deep. The educational system has not done justice to Black people. Yet stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod. Yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place from which our fathers sighed. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered, out from the gloomy past. You know, if we don't know the truth about our past, we don't have a keen sense of who we are. We don't know about the injustices we have been confronted with, and might I add, the accomplishments that we have made in the face of adversities. So I think it's important for us to talk about these sensitive subjects during Black history, and I might add, all the time. We have persevered under distress of oppression, oppressive laws, and for that reason, we want to talk about equal education as the great equalizer and the continuing stony the road we trod. You know, if it were not for the Black churches, Black students were outlawed from attending public schools. So the Black church stepped up to the plate. In the Black church, that is where historical Black colleges and universities were birthed. We all know that separate was not equal. We know that. No restroom facilities for Black children, no funding for Black schools, torn books, no paper and pencils, ventilation systems contributed to poor schooling, stress, and bad health. Now, for a moment, before we get into a dialogue, let's look at some case law that contributed to the inequality of education for Black children. You know, if you look at Plessy versus Ferguson back in 1892, though specifically it was not an educational case, it impacted that whole premise of separate but equal. And this included education. You know, I love reminding people right here in so-called free California, which entered the Union in 1850, state laws right here prohibited Black children from attending public schools. Now that's in free California, mind you. 1874 was the Ward versus Flood case, where a young girl named Mary Ann Ward in San Francisco, her parents wanted her to attend a school that was closer to her. However, that school was a white school, and it was ruled that since there was a separate school for Black children, even though further, she had to go there. Later, that law was amended to include, believe it or not, Chinese and Asian people. Then comes 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. That was a landmark case. Mr. Brown wanted his daughter Linda to attend a public school. And when she was, a public school near their home, she was denied that opportunity. Well, the case ended up in, the United States Supreme Court. And it was in this case that separate but equal was struck down. We look back at our past. Why is that important? Because we really have to have that sense of understanding the struggles that we have had. Ruby Bridges, when she was 6 years old, she became the first student to integrate an elementary school in Louisiana. We had the Little Rock Nine, where Black students enrolled in Central High. The military had to be called in to escort these students to and from school and from classes within the school. I want that to resonate with you for a moment. A distinguished educator wrote these words: every kid wants to be something. They want to be able to prove to someone that they are successful. And if given a chance, they will move forward to do just that. And when they have that kind of desire, there is not much that can hold them back. That distinguished educator happens to be none other than Mr. Tommie Lindsey, who is a guest speaker today. Welcome, Mr. Tommie Lindsey.
Thank you very much.
You know, let's open up with this. Tell us a little bit about your role as a forensic coach, and why did you establish a life skills class for Black males? And I believe, you know, females were included as well.
Well, it's first of all, I want to start with the life skills class because I think it's the most important. When I was teaching at James Logan High School, I noticed at one of the graduations that only 8 Black males had graduated in a class of 800. And that was very disconcerting for me. So I decided that I needed to set up something to give the Black males a pathway. Later, there was a life skills class established for Black women as well. You're absolutely correct. The class was, I was met with a lot of, feedback, negative feedback, because people said it was biased, it was racist, it was very sexist, and so on and so forth. And then I referred to the expulsions, the suspensions in our district of Black males, and the achievement gap that was so low. That was my retort to their responses. And it really kind of quelled the negativity really quickly. So far as the forensics is concerned, I became the forensics coach in 1989 at Logan. It was the first time this had ever happened. And I used that in order to, that particular, forum, in order to bring in young African-American males and females into the activity.
Okay, so why is it titled Forensic Coach? Talk to us about that.
Well, the word forensics derives from the Latin, which means a forum. And when there were deaths in the early days, a group of doctors would gather around to find a cause of death. And likewise, through interpretation and through honest debate, you search for the truth. And so that's why the term forensics is used. I
see. I'm quite familiar with that term as it relates to forensic evidence in police work. You know, you're looking at trace evidence and how you can make a match with some of the most minute things that make a big difference.
Right, and that's searching for the truth.
Searching for the truth.
The right answer.
Exactly. So, Mr. Lindsey, tell us about how you measured the success of your program. Speak to us a little bit about that.
Well, one of the things that I thought was very important, especially for the African-American males and females, is that they were able to embrace their own history. They were able to do selections like the Tuskegee Airmen, something Harriet Tubman, having our say. All of these selections that we were able to do in our interpretation were not only educational and motivating and built self-esteem for them, but it also educated the other students that were a part of that class because they were not learning this in their history classes.
I see. You know, you made quite a bit of difference in just what you did in terms of that support for the students that came through your classes. I am pretty sure many of them have achieved accomplishments that otherwise they would not have had. Do you agree with, yeah?
Absolutely. They've gone on to become professors, lawyers, doctors. But I also would always give, honor and respect to the Dr. Asa Hilliard, who
Yes.
is my mentor in so many ways. He, he made the statement, I have never encountered a kid that wasn't a genius. There's no secret as to how to teach them. First, you respect them, and then you love them. And that philosophy has allowed me to be in education, or to have been in education for over 40 years.
That is so powerful. You know, that is so very powerful and so meaningful. And I believe, the beauty of why Black historical colleges came into being is because there's something very special when students are able to look at people such as yourself, others that have that love, that desire to want to have them fulfill the best of who they are.
You're absolutely correct, and we stand on the shoulders of all of those forefathers, and especially my grandmother and a woman by the name of Mrs. Dukes. I'm standing on their shoulders. They laid the foundation, and I hope I pass it on to the youth. So I'm very blessed to be able to do that.
Just listening at you say that just reminds me of that song that says, only what I do for Christ will last. What you're done in education has a lasting impact, not only just directly on those students, but their families, and if they're married, children as well.
Well, thank you.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Sister Patsy Lockhart, a dear friend, a distinguished educator, and I might say she's a co-part of the Historical Archive Ministry here at Allen Temple, in addition to being a wonderful choir member. You have done a lot of work in the past as a lobbying for funding for urban youth. Talk briefly about that, and then I want you to tell us about your role in education.
Thank you for this opportunity. I think it started basically when I was a first year teacher, and I was assigned a third grade class, and the kids that I had, they used a reading series that created a lot of disadvantages. And I couldn't understand why just simply reading these books were these kids failing. And it was mainly the kids of color, in particular the boys. So I moved on to a higher grade, and I started looking at teachers who did not like our children, and it was very obvious, and it was a culture of that. And those kids were underachievers as well.
So, just a quick minute. Tell us, what was the ethnicity of these teachers?
All of them were white.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all of them were white. And there was a sense of camaraderie, a culture of how they treated kids of color. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they wouldn't call their last names, and you could just feel the disconnect in the learning of the children. And so when I got them, I just simply loved them, built a relationship with them. That was the first thing. And I didn't focus on academics. There's cognition, and then there's affective learning. But if you, like Mr. Lindsey said, if you don't love them, you can't teach them. And that's what they were looking for. So I started using that along with being a Bay Area Writing Project teacher, where children are able to write about themselves and journal what they like and what they dislike. And that element alone allowed a lot of self-esteem success, and it improved attendance. And I'm going, well, this is something that works. This is something way different than what I learned in college on how to be a teacher and how to read. It wasn't the calling of words. It was the connections they made to who was in the books and what they did. And
Right.
And that whole socialization that our kids need, that was missing in my early teaching. So it was, you sit in your seat, you sit in a row, you read Run, Sally, Run. And,
I remember that.
and those kids weren't having it. And so I started feeling the spirit of disconnect to that. So I thought, what if we built the classroom like a community instead of just a classroom? And that element alone allowed my kids to feel that they had a place, that they were loved, that they dropped their defenses. They played role, they had active roles on how we made the community work in the class. And that element alone increased their academics and their achievements by years. And so the other thing that caught my attention is that I had the principal's son in my class, and she did not believe that he made 5 years growth on the achievement test. So she accused me of cheating on the test. So they retested my kids.
Were they trying to imply that you were trying to build up your program and giving them higher grades than they deserved, or? Well,
yeah, they said I was giving them the answers because up to that time, the kids were low achievers.
Okay.
Like I said, there was a culture and they treated them that way. So all of a sudden they were doing as well or better than the kids that were high achievers. They couldn't believe it. And when they tested them again, they did better than they did the first time.
They're getting better and better, and you've done work with the Black Panthers and education as well, have you not?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Briefly about that.
My early years with the Panther was to promote the 10-point platform.
Yeah.
And I felt that the Panthers love their community and they love their people. And that platform set up elements that were to provide for the community what the government and the outside community didn't provide.
Exactly. And
so I used that as an element as a teaching tool in my classroom to get them to self-identify, critically analyze, make connections to whatever they did, and to empower themselves and empower their family and their community. So that community sense built from the classroom to their own homes to the broader community. And that was the East Palo Alto community.
Thank you so very much for that. Dr. Tasha Dean. Dr. Tasha Dean, she's a longtime member of Allen Temple, but she is also an esteemed educator. She is, as I've stated, an assistant superintendent of student services and special education in Sunnyvale. Dr. Dean, talk to us. First of all, welcome again, and talk to us about the position you hold and tell us exactly what is special education.
Well, again, thanks for having me to have this wonderful conversation. And before responding to your question directly, I think it's important to understand I am a passionate educator. And what led me to become or want to be in administration is I felt like as an educator, I could impact my classroom and the students that I work with each day, each week, each year. But it was only limited to that group of students primarily. And so I wanted to move to a position that would afford me the opportunity to kind of work with those students, but other students as well, and also influence the education that our students are getting. In particular, I've been a special educator because, it's the advocacy. These are often the students who are mistreated. Unfortunately, our kids, our Black and brown kids, end up in this, having this identification often much earlier than they really should. And they're kind of tracked through, and the rigor and the expectation for those students ends up not happening, for lack of a better word. So my role as Assistant Superintendent, Special Ed and Student Services, I oversee our special education programs. And what that entails is, one, of course, there's always compliance, but it's bigger than compliance because it's about what are you really doing? Like, should we even be identifying certain students, looking at trends and being sure, for example, that African-American males are not misidentified for being emotionally disturbed or having aggression issues and things of that nature, because often they get put into those boxes, and it's a very difficult box to get out of once you've been put in it. So it's not a problem to be in special ed, but it's how you got there and should you even really be there in the first place. And so a big part of my role is to ensure that, in particular, when we're assessing, are we assessing with fidelity? Are we being cognizant of the language differences, the cultural differences that may impact how children are responding and what they're doing? And is that being considered before we place a label such as special education on a child? And then once that label is applied, being sure that we continue to use the language differences, the cultural backgrounds to educate and influence how the child gets educated, because that is very critical to them getting what they need and kind of overcoming the label if they do have it, understanding it, what to do with it, educating the family so that the family understands it. And for some of our families, it's really difficult. And they kind of almost feel like sometimes it's a death sentence. Like, because my child's been labeled, like there's no hope, but there's quite a bit of hope. There's quite a bit of things that we can do for students that allows them to compensate and also allows them to live with their uniqueness, is the way I like to look at it, and understanding that. And that's very powerful when a student knows that, and it's very powerful when a parents and their family understand it, because they can help them navigate the system, they can help them get what they need, so that ultimately they can be a very successful student, regardless to the disability that they may hold. So that's one half of it. And then the second half is the side I really love, because it's about wrapping students with everything they need to be successful. So we have kids who come with health problems. We have kids who come with some mental health needs. We have kids who come with just needing to know how to have food and shelter. And so a big part of my role is to supervise teams that will fill in the gaps, fill in the holes, so that those don't become obstacles and keep kids from learning and getting the access that they deserve. So that's, in a nutshell, kind of what the work entails.
That's very important work. And when we look at special education, my granddaughter is deceased. She was in special education because she had physical and mental needs that no way a regular classroom could address. But let's just say, I'm going to come from a parent's perspective. My little Johnny has been in school for a couple, 3 years. My son, which I don't have, is now maybe in the 3rd or 4th grade. And then I get a call from the school that says, Ms. Taylor, we want to talk to you. We think that little Johnny needs to be in special education. Now, little Johnny doesn't have any physical needs, but there is something that they have determined that says he no longer can become the best that he can, I'm assuming, in a regular classroom. So what do they look for that places little Johnny in the special education versus continuing in a regular classroom environment?
Good question. So you hope that they're coming because they've noted something that's really valid. So maybe it's a reading difficulty, or maybe it's an attention difficulty, or maybe suddenly there's a difficulty in reading and comprehending, and it's more specific. So maybe it comes in that form. So whenever a student is identified as having some specialized needs, it's really important that something happened before we talk about special education. So what I mean by that is that this challenge didn't just suddenly pop up. So the hope would be that a teacher, a principal, a counselor, or someone has reached out early to talk about what some of the challenges are for a student. In schools, they have what's called, and this is all schools, not some schools, all schools, they have what's called either a study success team or a study student team or something to that effect. And the whole purpose for that meeting is to talk about my student is not doing well. For whatever reason, my child's not doing well. And it's a meeting to talk about why my student is not doing well, right? My child. So that's an opportunity to intervene, to provide some scaffolds, some support, some direction, so that the parent, one, can understand what's going on, but also know how to help their child. That's really important. It's one thing for the school to do some things, but it's also important for parents to understand so that they can have a better opportunity to understand what's going on and be a part of the solution to support their child. You would hope that that would happen, unless it's something very significant, but if we're talking learning or other challenges, that's the first thing that should happen before we jump into talking about a child should be in special education. So we're going to assume that happened. And now it is time to intervene because the plan has not been working. The student continues to have challenges that parent is not understanding, staff are not understanding. So in special education, there's 13 different eligibility criteria. I won't go into all of them, but the learning and the emotional ones are the most sensitive and sometimes difficult to understand and support. And so with that, there would be an assessment plan. Students, parent has the right to sign, talk about what they want to be assessed. The specialists have a right to say what they think is needed, but it's a collaboration. It should be that you're working together with the teacher, with the specialist to talk about what are you going to assess and what areas of need. And then those practitioners conduct the assessments. They should be reaching out to both the student, depending on their age, to get input from the child. And then they should be also getting input from the parents. And then you take all of that information together to try to make a decision as to, does this child have special needs? If this child does have special needs, what are they? And more importantly now, what are we going to do to intervene to support this child so the child can learn and be successful?
Very, very, very good. It's always been kind of like a stigma when we hear that word special education, and you've brought up some clarity. And I'm not going to linger there, but we know here in our Black community, oftentimes white people see us differently. And so they start out from a premise that, as I set the tone with the early framer of the Constitution, we're inferior. So when we do certain things or they don't understand our culture, we become ostracized. And I just thought I would bring that up.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So here we are, educators, and to you listeners out there, it's almost been a year since that invisible virus called coronavirus literally shut not just this nation, but the world down. And certainly it had an impact on education. Your parents found themselves suddenly that the kid is home. Some of them still had to work because so many of us, even though they said, a lot of us were not at work, we were in frontline positions that were not called frontline positions. So our kids were left at home. We had some of these problems with not having equal access to computers, a low broadband, just a myriad of different things. Sister Patsy, let me circle back to you and ask you a couple of things about how you perceive what is happening to our students now in this world called online education, and possibly the impact that it's going to have, in the long run.
Well, that's a good question. I think because we had such deficits before, if you look at the achievement of students of color, there were problems already in the classroom before, in the school system before the pandemic. So when we had to go into shelter in place, the alternative was to go by using the laptops and connect with broadband. And for the most part, those students or families who had broadband and were in a school where they provided the laptop, they were in a better position than those students who did not have it. So my concern was, how do we make it equal for everyone so that all children can learn? So everybody gets access to the same thing. And so what I've seen and what I've listened to in terms of talking to different families is there's some families that are completely shut out. There's some families that are struggling. Parents have had to become teachers, play a teacher role, and they weren't teachers. And then there's students like in special education who needed extra attention who weren't getting it. And
exactly.
So, pardon me?
I was just saying exactly, because some of these kids are blind. Some of them have other emotional disabilities that just putting them on a computer is not the same as having that personal nurturing in a classroom. I just see we will overcome this, but there are some real systemic problems here.
Yeah, I think we're going on a year now, and we still have a lot of questions on whether we're going to open schools or we're not going to open schools. And,
exactly.
And who has the computers and who doesn't have the computers and who's donating to broadband. It just spirals back to the deficits compounded with what existed before. And so we're at a point where, as a community, we talk about it takes a village, it takes the parent, it takes the school institution, but we're talking about the Black church. The Black church is the place where is part of that village as well. And so I remember when we were shut down, the electricity was shut down in Oakland, and Pastor Jackie opened up the church so that children could learn, and that whole willingness to make a difference for those kids who didn't have computers and broadband, that interest came up within our church community. And so I think whether you have a child in the district or not, whether your kids are grown or not, all children are our children. And we still have the responsibility to make that whole element of education work.
Exactly. I want to throw the ball to you, Mr. Tommie, and want you to chime in on this. What are some of the psychological effects that you think our children are experiencing from many hours on the computer and just not even having that camaraderie with, their fellow classmates? What stresses are they experiencing?
Well, it's quite apparent that the relationships are not happening that need to be with their friends in school, and as Patsy alluded to, with their teachers. It makes it real difficult. With the Speech and Debate League, we have done virtual competitions all over the country, but then there's an equity issue there. The computers and some of the students in different areas are not able to keep up with the bandwidth, and so that makes it difficult. But to answer your question, it's impacted students in an unbelievable way, and I really don't think we know what the damage is.
Exactly.
Really, and we won't. And I'd have to really yield to Dr. Dean on that. For many years to come, we're going to be trying to fix it, to rebuild, to restore.
Exactly. Dr. Dean, you want to chime in on that?
Absolutely. I want to also build on something that Patsy talked about, and that is that there were some achievement difficulties and gaps that existed before the pandemic.
Exactly.
Happened or will happen is those things go away suddenly. They're going to grow and they're going to build, and they're going to be worse when students come back. That's just a reality. And so what's going to be very important is what we do and how we approach that. And so you can't begin to plan and respond when students begin to come back. Your responding and your acting must be going on as we speak. And so it's important for teachers and administrators to be aware of that and start planning and integrating. But I think the place that I want to come from today is when we talk about the village, whether that's in our churches, our family units, that if you see your child struggling, I want parents to not feel paralyzed. There are places you can go, even within your school. In the worst, I would just say in the worst school district or worst school that you attend, there are supports and services. So I challenge families that may be listening to us this evening to go to your teacher first, follow your protocol. It's always good to follow the protocol because people know you understand, and hopefully they can be a better listener. But if your teacher doesn't have the answer and doesn't have the solution, go to your principal. The principal doesn't have the answers and solutions, then go to the next level until you get the answers and the direction you need for your child. This is one of those times that it's, in my opinion here, to be selfish. This is about the education of your child. So if your child's not getting what they need and you see the child needs more support, begin working on that support plan now so that you get the kids what they need. That will be very important. But the planning cannot start down the road. The planning has to start now. The support has to start now for our students. That's just imperative.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And there is a link that we're going to be able to provide. Maybe not right now, but I know in our newsletter, we are going to have resources that you have provided where our members can have access to help their children. As I was talking to my niece, she brought up a lot of different problems that she has encountered herself, but she really is one that can overcome, because she's the kind that will ask the questions. And just this whole business of, spending more money in terms of food, because for some students, free food has been provided for them, breakfast and lunch. that no longer is the case. But without proper communication, we find out that the schools do provide that. So it might be just some simple questions that a parent might have within that they need to just be able to communicate and come out with. You know, I look at the clock and I know our time is really fleeting. It's fleeting fast. And this is a very, very good conversation. A lot of times people say, well, I don't hear you guys doing any Bible study. We are doing Bible study. We're doing Bible study right now because we're looking at Luke 4:18, where Jesus came to set the captives free. And when we talk about education and people are being set aside, not treated equal, we're talking about freedom for these students. We are talking about putting biblical language into practical application. So when I think about our students, and I have a lot of nieces and nephews, and I have just a number of acquaintances, I think it's important for us to really understand where we have come from, where we are. And as Tommie Lindsey said, we don't even have a clue what the long-term effects will be on this. I just think we're looking at something that it happened, but the long-term effects are going to really show up in a way that is going to be a negative. I want to end on this note because of time. I don't want to end, but we have to end. We have a young, inspiring student in our church, and I wanted to showcase a young person, just as Amanda Gorman was showcased. And I've often said that when given the opportunity, you find that our communities are full of Amanda Gormans. Now, Jaden Nero Efren is only 9 years old. He hasn't been to a debate class, not yet. He's a third grader at Northern Lights in Oakland. His mother is Janet Nero, and we all know his grandparents, Jewel and Darlene Nero. They're longtime members of Allen Temple. Reverend Charlotte, if you can put up Jaden's little brief words and his feelings about John Lewis. Will you play that now for us?
John Robert Lewis was born February 21st, 1940, but he died July 17th of 2020. John Robert Lewis was known for one of the first Black people to ever get into American Congress. People loved him for that, and he made history. And one of his greatest acts is where he marched on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But that came with the cost. He was met by violent police officers who beat him and threw him in jail 30 times. That's a pretty long time to be in jail for. But that never stopped him. He was fighting and fighting for civil rights. Now, because of John Lewis, we have voting rights. Thank you, John Lewis. We love you. You made history. But that's not all. Here are his last words before he left us. Together, you can redeem the soul of our nation. Though I am gone, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. And he liked the song Happy. And I'm happy to talk about him because I do like the song Happy myself.
Wasn't that a wonderful speech by little Jaden? And we have a number of Jadens in our church and in the community. Well, I certainly hope that you have picked up some pearls, some words of wisdom that will enable you to be able to navigate through this system, to help your young child, maybe some other family member in this long road of education. It's not easy. Even our college students have been impacted by it. We more or less talked about the public school system. But the whole purpose was just to help us gain a keener sense of what is going on currently in our educational system, how we have had to strive to come over that stony road of various case law decisions, and how we have been prevented from even learning, starting in slavery. Well, this has been another wonderful evening. It's been on education. Next week, we're going to have 3 physicians talk about the crisis of the COVID in our communities. So I want you to go in peace. And as I pray us out, just remember to keep your hands washed, social distance, and remember, as I always say, to pray. God, we just thank you for this wonderful day. We thank you for our conversational partners that joined us to talk about education. We ask right now in the name of Jesus that those that have listened, that they have heard something that will help them. God, we're praying that this pandemic will come to an end. We're praying that those that have hesitations about even having the vaccine, that maybe they will be enlightened to know that the longevity of their life will be increased, where they are just not so victimized by this dangerous virus. God, we pray for our pastor, our church, and all of our listeners. We pray for our families. In the mighty name of Jesus, we say collectively, amen, and thank God. Goodbye.